Hi, this is our pre-reading lecture for our article by Saxton, and we're going to be talking about this idea of what it means to be both indispensable and invisible. So, in order to get into our first kind of historical article, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in 19th century California, and specifically what it's like to be Chinese in 19th century California. And then I'll give you all a few questions to keep in mind as you read Saxton's article for this week. So, as we are probably familiar with, the 19th century in the United States is an era not only marked by the Civil War, but also marked by this westward expansion. So the increasing amount of Eastern Americans and new immigrants moving across the continent, seizing lands from native people and laying claim to it as part of this lens or this view that was referred to as manifest destiny. This is a painting that has a personification of manifest destiny, the lady carrying a book and guiding all the quote-unquote brave pioneers across the country. So there is this sense that with the coming of white settlers across the United States, there's this idea that this is morally right, this is justifiable, it's inevitable, it was bound to happen. And part of this is related to that concept of bringing civilization to the wilderness. And this tension between wilderness and civilization is something that we're going to explore in a later unit in our class, these different conceptions of how to look at the value of the land. But what we want to think about here is that California is the kind of final frontier of this narrative of American manifest destiny, reaching the furthest coast, reaching another ocean, was seen to be this kind of prophecy fulfilled, and California becomes a huge driver in westward expansion and in the projects of infrastructure such as the railroad that you all will be reading about as well. So there's two events that lead to huge waves of migrants to California, one of them the Gold Rush, and the other the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act is essentially there were several versions of it, but it is a way that white settlers get government sanction to seize land either free of cost or low cost. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our unit on land as well. Okay, so these are just some advertisements about coming out to California. This claim that, you know, there's so much gold in California, it's coming out of the mountains, right? This kind of golden sunrise that we're seeing in this image here. And then the craziest thing about this advertisement about coming to California is that it was faster to take a ship from the East Coast to get to California. So that tells us a little bit about the necessity of a project like the Transcontinental Railroad, that it's so challenging to move across the continental United States that many miners from the east who are interested were taking boats all the way through Central America, right? So stopping in Nicaragua on the way to California. Okay, so let's talk about a group of migrants who were also drawn to California. So one of the things that we see being enacted a few years after the beginning of the gold rush that is making all these promises about, you know, come out here, get rich, and inducing settlers to come out and see what they can see, we see the enactment of the foreign miners tax in 1852. And so this tax wasn't in reference to all quote-unquote foreigners, all immigrants. The tax affected immigrants who are not eligible for citizenship. And what that meant at the time, based on this other piece of law, the Naturalization Act of 1790, it was a racially defined group of people. So the Naturalization Act of 1790 declared that immigrants who were eligible for citizenship were, quote, whites of good character, unquote. And so this excluded Native Americans, slaves, freed Americans, and Asians. So all these individuals were not included in this pathway to citizenship according to the Naturalization Act of 1790. And then building on that, the foreign miners tax kind of puts another it's attached to this categorization that comes out of the Naturalization Act as well. So we see the creation of a tiered immigration system in which European immigrants have a pathway solely based on their race. And so this tax in particular was aimed at two groups who were really prevalent in gold mining in California: Latin American and Chinese miners. And so the foreign miners tax was supposed to, promise the riches of California to this, to white individuals of quote-unquote good character. So we begin to see this kind of uneven access to the promises of riches, wealth, and comfort in California is already part of California's 19th century history. Okay, so what we see happening here is that the foreign miners tax was successful in deterring Latin American miners because, for one thing, it was a lot easier for them to leave California and return home, whereas for Chinese miners, it was quite a journey to come to California. So Chinese miners remained in large numbers, and they were among the largest group of individuals involved in gold mining who were not white. And so what we begin to see is a lot of racial tension, and in particular anti-Chinese sentiments growing as part of this kind of claim for California's riches. So what we see happening in California politics on the local level is that California Democrats kind of made a political play capitalizing on the anti-Chinese sentiments of folks living in California at that time. They used this as a kind of part of their platform and used it as a political organizing tool. So the political cartoon that we're looking at here is telling us about this Chinese wall around the United States of America. The latter says immigration, and up here we have white immigrants who came to the United States to seek their fortune and a better life, essentially kicking down the ladder after they made it in. Throwing down the ladder by which they rose, excluding Chinese immigrants from this promise of California's riches and the promise of coming to the United States to create a new life and a new community for themselves. Okay, so we see this anti-Chinese sentiment manifesting not only in political organization, but also in public acts of violence. So here in Los Angeles, near Union Station, there was a really horrifying massacre, essentially a lynching, in 1871, where 500 white men invaded Chinatown and kidnapped and lynched 17 Chinese men and boys in broad daylight. They were taken from their homes during the day and brought to a gallows into what is now Union Station. So this was a kind of California corollary to what we may have heard about happening in the American South in terms of extrajudicial, non-legal executions of individuals, and there being no consequences for the people who are doing these public lynchings. So no one served crime, no one served time for this crime, and the police and city government did not get involved, and this happened in broad daylight in a very public space. So this kind of gives us an insight into the way that both the laws on the books and behavior off the books is contributing to an extremely hostile and dangerous situation for Chinese individuals living in California at this time. Okay, so as I mentioned, this capitalization or this kind of mobilization of anti-Chinese sentiment as a tool for political organization is taken up by working class politics, right? So this political party called the Working Man's Party is developing a great deal of political power in San Francisco. And what we see happening here is that the Working Man's Party essentially chooses the Chinese community as a scapegoat, as an enemy, as the group that is keeping their wages low, as the group that is keeping them poor. So we see this very derogatory cartoon that was used as a way of recruiting for the Working Man's Party. This is, an advertisement for who they would like you to vote for in a local election. So using this very derogatory depiction of kicking the Chinese out of California. So what we see happening here is, these union organizations are essentially also solidifying their political power around anti-Chinese sentiments and are becoming essentially kind of radicalized into people that both support the plight of working class people, but also are viewing their plight from the perspective of blaming a single racial group for bad working conditions and bad wages and stuff like that. Okay, so we see this we see the Chinese community becoming an indispensable enemy. So something that is useful as a political organizing tool, a group that could be blamed for what was a post-Civil War pretty major economic recession. So blaming an immigrant group, as we are probably familiar with, is a kind of unfortunately tried and repeated tactic used by political parties when the actual reasons for an economic downturn or low wages are more complicated. All right, so we see the federal government essentially taking the lead of California in this case. So the federal government in 1882 passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so they have been influenced by the laws and by the activities of politicians and lawmakers in California. And what this act does is it bans Chinese immigration for 10 years, and it permanently makes Chinese individuals ineligible for citizenship as well. So even before this act was passed, Chinese individuals could not own property, they couldn't use public facilities such as public schools, they couldn't testify in courts, and so we begin to see this kind of codification of exclusion of the Chinese community from using any public institutions, seeking justice, owning property, all of this kind of stuff. This is another political cartoon from the era that shows the Chinese immigrant on the outside of this Golden Gate of Liberty. And this cartoon is sympathetic to the plight of the Chinese immigrant, suggesting that the Chinese immigrant brings with them industry, order, peace, sobriety. And then the sign on the side is sort of a critique of the influence of some European immigrants. So notice communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, which is Irish radicals, and hoodlums welcome, but no admittance to Chinese people. Okay. So this kind of political tactic that we're looking at here is referred to as nativism. And this is a tendency that has ebbed and flowed in terms of its popularity and viability as a political stance in the United States. It opposes immigration. So what we see is nativist thought is subscribing to this logic of targeting and focusing a group of immigrants to blame for economic downturns, for crime, or this kind of changing nature of cultural values. So this image that we're looking at here is suggesting this fear of Catholics in the 19th century. So this is the Pope, and the suggestion is that if there's too many Catholics in the United States, they're essentially going to be doing the bidding of the Pope. There he is controlling Washington, and, shall he be allowed to rule America? So in the 19th century, nativism had a lot of targets, including the Chinese community, including Catholic immigrants as well. So it's a form of xenophobia, this fear of the other, but it is framed as patriotic, right? Preserving American identity and values. And I'd imagine this sounds pretty familiar, and we'll talk a little bit about how this plays out in our contemporary politics as well. Okay, so what we see happening in the labor movement more broadly is that race has historically served as a wedge issue that divides the working class against itself. So instead of working class people of different races working together, we've historically seen the way that the working class movement, working class politics has been divided by this kind of issue of racial difference, fighting over the same jobs, or whatever the narrative might be. And that serves immediate political needs, but it makes the working class less powerful over time. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get together for our Zoom meeting. Okay, so we're talking about the railroad. It's pretty important. It connects the nation in this really powerful way, and it puts California on the map as an economic superpower, and it unites the nation. So this is the project that we'll be reading about for class on Wednesday, on Wednesday. And these are the two questions I want you to keep in mind. So what does it mean to be an indispensable enemy? So when we're thinking about that, as you read Saxton, and we'll talk more about it when we get together. Thanks.